morning, everyone, and welcome to Geneva Trade Week and to this session on trade, biodiversity, and natural resources. What role for trade policy in a New Deal for Nature? So my name is Carolyn Deer-Burbeck, and I'm an Associate Fellow at Chatham House's Hoffman Center for Sustainable Resource Economy and a Senior Researcher at Geneva's Graduate Institute. I'll be moderating our session this morning on behalf of our two co-hosts, the UN Environment Programme, Unep, and the UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD. So the need to conserve, sustainably use and restore biodiversity and natural resources is high in the mind of world leaders this week, with over 60 joining a Leaders' Pledge for Nature in the lead up to the UN's Biodiversity Summit. They've committed to reversing biodiversity loss by 2030. So these mounting calls for a new global deal for nature are also spurring growing interest in the relevance of trade and in global supply chains and the role of trade policies and institutions. So some key questions for us today are what do new calls for a new deal for nature mean for trade and trade policy? What do we know about the negative impacts of trade on biodiversity and how can we reduce them? How can trade and trade policy and trade policy be harnessed as tools to promote biodiversity and sustainable resource use? And what kind of supply side chain solutions, information, and policy initiatives do we need that could help align trade and biodiversity protection, both in the context of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and also in the context of the UN's SDGs? And for us based in Geneva, how can we take some of these ideas and initiatives forward in the multilateral trading system as well? So to guide us through these questions, our co-hosts have gathered an excellent and diverse set of speakers from UN agencies, government, NGOs, the scientific community, and think tanks. The first half hour of this session will be devoted to presentations from our speakers and panelists, followed by a half hour for discussion. So during the session, please do post any comments or questions on the chat or in the Q&A box so that I can try and take these up during the discussion. You can also post links to resources you'd like to share there. If you're tweeting about the panel, then please use the GTW2020 hashtag. So with that, let's get started. So to offer remarks on behalf of UNEP, I give the floor first to Stephen Stone, who is the Chief of UNEP's Resources and Markets Branch. Stephen, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Carolyn. Good morning, colleagues, or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. It's a great pleasure to open this up with our co-host from UNCTAD, and Isabel, delighted that you'll be providing the keynote this morning. This is an event which is also sponsored by our colleagues at the Unep World Conservation Monitoring Center. You hear from the chief scientist of the Wcmc as part of the Trade Hub initiative, which is a new initiative which is getting off the ground with the support from the UK, which looks at the impacts of trade on biodiversity. It's a very ambitious undertaking, a major consortium effort, and we're so pleased to be part of that effort along with our colleagues at WCMC and many, many others. I have 4 points just to kick it off, and I'm sure we're going to really have a deep dive conversation on the role of trade and nature. And Carolyn, thanks for mentioning the Leaders' Pledge for Nature. I'm so thrilled to see so many high-level people making that commitment to by 2030 protect or set aside 30% of their land coverage. We heard that from the Prime Minister of the UK and many others. If you go to the website, you can hear these wonderful pledges from across the world. My first point, COVID-19, we hear so much about it, it's on everyone's mind. From UNEP's point of view, and our executive director has said, this is a message from nature. Nature is sending us a message, and it might not be a message that we want to hear, but the fact is, as we increase our economic activity and we expand our footprint across the world, we reduce that thin line that separates us from wildlife. And zoonosis is a transmission. It's a disease which jumps from wildlife animals to people. They're becoming more recurrent. Over the past 2 decades, over $200 billion worth of damages. And of course, this episode, if I can put it like that, is shattering all the records. I mean, the GDP hit of -5% globally, which is forecast. That's a $7 or $8 trillion hit to the world economy, outside of the stimulus packages of $10 to $12 trillion. So just the magnitude of the impact of COVID and zoonosis is a major message from nature. And I think that needs to frame our minds as we think about trade, which encapsulates 1/3 of global GDP right now. So a very big part of the global economy is impacted by trade. The second point I wanted to share with you in these welcome remarks is you could even think about nature as our most important safety net. We talk a lot about safety nets now that COVID is impacting and the lockdown is hitting, but it's one of our safety nets that's being stretched to the very limits. And one of the reflection on the ACHI targets was the first round of biodiversity targets for 2020 was we haven't met them. In spite of all the good efforts and the goodwill, we're still encroaching on nature very much. And there's a lot of studies that have come out recently, including one from IPBES, which looks at the 1 million species which are under threat of extinction. So it remains very, very urgent. And again, trade is a huge driver of potential impacts. Now, whether that materializes or not depends on how trade is governed, how trade is transacted, which kind of trade policies are in play. And I think that's the conversation from Unep's point of view, which is so important. It's not about just pointing fingers or putting a blame somewhere. It's about stewarding the global public good, which is the rules-based system for trade, and ensuring that the rules are fair and that they support a clean and green environment into the future. And that's a tricky question. It's $1 million question. And so, Carolyn, I'm really looking forward to the conversation today because I know our panelists have so much to offer, whether from the view of states which are negotiating these deals or from individuals who are closely tracking how trade is evolving into the future. My one plea, let us think very carefully how we protect this global public good, which is nature, and the rules-based system, which ensures that trade is good for nature. With that, Carolyn, back over to you and wish us all the very best for this discussion this morning.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen, for that welcome and to setting out the wider political context, of course, of COVID-19. And I loved your idea of seeing these as twin global public goods, an effective multilateral trading system, a safety net, a safety net that nature can provide, and the need to link the two of those together. So that's a really great start for us. So I'll now turn the floor to our keynote speaker, Isabelle Durand, who is now the Deputy Secretary General of UNCTAD. She came to that post after a very distinguished career in both Belgian and European politics. And at UNCTAD, she's recognized as a compelling advocate of the need to integrate and address environmental considerations in work on trade and development. So Isabelle, you have the floor.
Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, thank you for the invitation because so you just said, Caroline, I'm really involved and committed on this important issue that Steve Stone shows very well, the importance to link and to really work on trade and environment, and especially on environment and trade, and that's important for me. So I'm very pleased to be here with you today. So just to present my organization, UNCTAD is the United Nations agency responsible for international trade and sustainable development, and as such, through one branch of UNCTAD called Trade and Environment Branch, we contribute directly in addressing the nexus between trade and environment and sustainable development, and advancing the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. So trade is an indispensable component of national economies. It involves business, societies, and biodiversity. Approximately 40% of the world's economy is derived from the direct use of biodiversity. Good or not good, but that's the global figure. And trade, therefore, can and should be part of any solution to reverse biodiversity loss, which is not only an environmental issue, but an economic and social as well. So trade needs to be mainstreamed into the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. It is crucial to ensure that any reference to trade addresses both the challenges and the opportunities for biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. Trade policy and making trade sustainable are essential for the transformative change we need for reversing biodiversity loss and living in harmony with nature. And if conducted under environmental, social, and economic sustainability criteria, and I'm sure that also Jean-Marie Pogam will speak about that, trade can be sustainable. It can be. but it is definitely not automatic. And especially in this pandemic period, indirectly related to the cause, and Steve shows very well the message from nature related to the cause of this pandemic. Trade policy can help orient global trade patterns in a direction that contributes to the achievement of the objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity and will make a positive contribution to achieving the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. First, it promotes and incentivizes sustainable use of biodiversity and generates income, wealth, and economic security for livelihoods. Second, it engages private sector actors, small, medium, and large enterprises in the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and the access and sharing of benefits. Third, sustainable trade leverages additional financial resources and supports mainstreaming of biodiversity. And fourth, trade policy can support phasing out perverse incentives to biodiversity, such as fish and fuel subsidies, both considered as perverse incentives harmful for biodiversity. And I cannot make this introductory speech without mentioning Aichi Biodiversity Target 3.1 is one of the targets where less progress has been made over the past decade, as reported in the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook. This is what UNCTAD has been promoting, sustainable trade through its Biotrade initiatives since 1996 and the Oceans Economy and Fisheries Program. UNCTAD coined the word Biotrade, which promotes the sustainable biodiversity-based production and trade of products and services such as quinoa, marula, and bird watching. Biotrade adds economic value to biodiversity through its wise use and trade in order to provide incentives for its conservation, the sharing of benefit, and encourage private sector engagement. Moreover, biodiversity has been mainstreamed into the trade sector and considered in the formulation of trade policies. This has created incentives for biodiversity-friendly harvesting and production at the community level, as well as opportunities for companies to transform their business model by adopting biodiversity-friendly practices. And over the years, 5 million jobs have been generated and sales of Biotrade companies, associations, and initiatives sustainably sourcing product in 2019 amount to more or less 5.15 billion euro. So we are pleased also to have in the panel the possibility to speak with the Union for Ethical Biotrade, because that's important. I visit myself the Biotrade initiative in Peru, and I was really impressed of the quality and the really commitment in this regard. UNCTAD Ocean Economy and Fisheries Program and Unep have a strategic partnership since 2016, and jointly with FAO developed an interagency joint plan of action for achieving the trade-related targets of SDG 14. The joint plan seeks a rapid progress towards tackling illegal fishing, addressing and phasing out fish subsidies, improving management of stocks, supporting the development of the blue economy, and improving market access for small-scale fishers. The joint plan of action will be a step towards supporting the sustainable use and conservation of our marine biodiversity realm in the post-2020 era. Last but not least, let me finish by highlighting that we cannot value what we cannot measure, particularly in trade policy. Assisting countries to assess and monitor the legal trades of biodiversity-based products is crucial. And this is why UNCTAD's Biotrade initiative and the Development Statistic and Information Branch are developing a trade and biodiversity statistical tool to provide trade flows of biodiversity-based products. The trade and biodiversity communities will be able to determine the trends and value of this legal trade since 2007 and its importance to the national and global economies. The tool will be launched in 2021 and may also be an important indicator under the post-2020 monitoring framework. Today's session comes at an opportune time. Tomorrow, 30th of September, world leaders will be at the UN Biodiversity Summit under the theme Urgent Action on Biodiversity for Sustainable Development. And we hope to bring the compelling message that sustainable trade and trade policy can contribute to the overall vision of the new global framework to live in harmony with nature. So thank you very much, and I wish you a fruitful discussion and count on the engagement and the commitment of UNCTAD and especially Biotrade and Ocean staff working a lot in order to produce our contribution to the global debate. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Isabel, for an excellent overview of the landscape of trade-related challenges and opportunities for developing countries in this area of biodiversity, as well as the trade policy implications. The key point that I took away from your opening part of your remarks was that trade can and should be part of any solution to biodiversity loss. It plays a huge role in the global economy. It's not only an environmental issue, but also a social and an economic one as well. And great to hear about the specific work that UNCTAD is undertaking in this area on Biotrade initiative and also in terms of the blue economy. So let me turn now to offer to our panelists to offer their perspectives. We have around 7 minutes per speaker, and we have, while the panelists are speaking, I just remind you to those on the call to please submit your views on questions. And to start, and for a perspective from a seasoned trade diplomat in Geneva and an active supporter of environmental sustainability in trade, I'd like to give the floor to Jean-Marie Paugam, who is the permanent representative of France to the World Trade Organization. And he was most recently the chair of the WTO's Committee on Trade and Environment. Jean-Marie, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, everyone. Thank you to the coordinator for inviting me to participate to this conversation and this very topical question. My first message will be very simple, and will be very convergent with what the two previous speakers have been saying. My government has a very straightforward answer to the question of trade and environment. Trade represents 1/3 of the world GDP, and the COVID is at least, at minimum, a big hole. So those who still pretend that trade policy should not mingle with environment or non-trade concern are just, for us, beside the point. They are making nonsensical, obsolete, and unacceptable arguments now to the world. And the same with green protectionism and all that old-fashioned thinking. In fact, the opposite is true since the inception of the system, and we all know, for instance, that GATT Article 20, since the beginning of the World Trading System, states that environment and health have a superior value to trade. And it's also embodied in the preamble of the Marrakesh Agreement, which does not mention the word free trade, as everybody feels, but mentions the word sustainable development. So the purpose of the organization is sustainable development through trade. And this has, by the way, one anecdote. What was in the mind of the negotiators of the GATT? Guess what? Was conservation of resources. What resources? Fish. And we still have fish here in the WTO being negotiated. So it has been a continuity. Regarding biodiversity, there is a very recent research from our leading international economic think tank, CEPI, which I just posted on the chat space here, which establishes very clearly that there is a link between trade and the contribution of trade to biodiversity losses through both direct and indirect impact, direct through transportation and induced pollutions, and also introduction of pathogens, elements, and invasive species, and more indirectly through habitat change, overexploitation, and other forms of pollution. So all the indicators are there that biodiversity loss are accelerating, and the OECD also has been recently warning the heads of state. So this is why I think it was Stephen Stone who mentioned this leaders pledge for nature, which was endorsed yesterday by the President of France, along with 64 heads of state and government. This is very important ahead of the UN summit on biodiversity. So what can trade policy do about it? For us, the key point is first the paradigm. Environment, as I think Isabel has been mentioning, environment can no longer be considered as some externality to trade, so some side effects that needs to be compensated for. It should be considered as an intrinsic part of our trade policies, a part of the model. What is at stake now is mainstreaming environment into trade policy. So do we have tools to do so? In my country, the thinking has been accelerated by the CETA bilateral agreement between the EU and Canada, which steered a lot of political debate and work. And so we developed a little bit of the embryo of doctrine on trade and environment, which was also elaborated with the Netherlands. And France and Netherlands recently issued a common paper in the EU about this issue. First, it should be said that sustainable impact assessment remain the basis for any policy making, and much more can be done in that field. So to some extent, the sustainable impact assessments of trade agreements has become a little bit of a routine exercise, like ticking the environment box. No, it can be much more elaborated and impacting on policy making. So we have been starting to do our own sustainable assessment, and they give results which are really interesting in feeding the debate, and they have political consequences. And the most recent one was on the Mercosur, where the French have been releasing a report. Based on this, we are really determined to oppose every trade agreement that would not contain enough guarantees to prevent adverse environmental consequences because of unsustainable trade practices. And this is a stance which has been a warning which has been expressed by my highest authorities against the current state of play of the Mercosur agreement, which, given the model that we have been running, as it stands, does not prevent enough the risk of deforestation of the Amazonian forest by liberalizing some products in agriculture which would not be produced through a sustainable method. So the bottom line for us is that when a product is scaling up deforestation or contributing to climate change, it should not be promoted inside the EU market. Third, together with the Netherlands, we have been tabling in Brussels a proposition to give substance to our climate commitment, and this should be part, in our mind, of the Green Deal, and that's about compliance with the Paris Agreement and its legally binding obligation. For us, the Paris Agreement should become an essential element of all trade agreements which would be negotiated and concluded by the EU. And if a trading partner does not want to respect its own obligation and commitments under the Paris Agreement, then the EU should be able to put a brake on its trade. That's rubbish. Fourth, and finally, here in the WTO, which is my primary focus, of course, fisheries is the overarching priority for us, as for many members. But we also want to push and promote a lot of other discussions where exchanges of best practices could steer action-oriented proposition on trade policy. For instance, a topic like fossil fuel subsidy reform is very interesting to my country. The issue of plastics, which has been put forward by several members, is also a very important issue. And as such, we are particularly interested and mobilized to push for prompt finalization of the FAST declaration. FAST stands in the WTO for Friends of Advanced Sustainable Trade. So this is a group of like-minded countries or green-minded countries, or including the EU, which are wanted to find new avenues to discuss expeditiously environment issues. So we are really much in favor of this, and we hope that some political initiatives in that field will be taken rather sooner than later. I think I'll stop here there and be happy to elaborate whether you would think that useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie, for that excellent perspective. I wanted particularly to thank you for the recent report from CEPI, and as we'll hear next also from Neil, there is a lot of excellent research underway to try and really track and understand the links between trade and biodiversity issues. It may seem like a complex issue, but in fact, we have a lot of research already on the table and under development that really looks at the direct and indirect linkages and impacts. So that's really valuable for this discussion going forward. I also really appreciated the emphasis on mainstreaming environment into trade policy, the role of sustainability impact assessments in that, but more importantly, their use by policymakers afterwards as a key elements. And finally, thank you for drawing our attention to the work underway at the WTO to also look for multilateral ways and processes through which governments and stakeholders can discuss environmental sustainability issues and how to move them forward in the trading arena. So, and biodiversity would be a part, as I understand it, of that ministerial statement. So thank you very much for that. I will turn the floor now to Neil Burgess, who is the head scientist at the Unep World Conservation Monitoring Center, WCMC. They, as Stephen mentioned at the beginning, have just launched a really impressive 5-year research project trying to understand more about the links between biodiversity and trade. So he's our scientist on our panel, and he's going to give us a snapshot of some of the tools and metrics and work that they're doing to inform this policy discussion on trade and biodiversity. So Neil, you have the floor.
Thank you, Carolyn, and everybody. I've got 7 slides, and I'm going to try to make 7 kind of major points, 1 for each slide. So on this first opening slide, the main point is that 2020 was supposed to be the super year for nature. So we were supposed to, actually, if you can go back 1 slide, 2020 was supposed to be the super year for nature, where we were going to have a new biodiversity agreement, and 2021 was supposed to be a major meeting of the climate convention in the UK. In fact, 2020 is going to become 2021 when both of these major meetings are going to happen in the same year. And the preparation for the post-2020 biodiversity deal is still happening. I mean, I've personally been looking and following all of the negotiations around the goals, the targets, and the indicators in that post-2020 plan. And at the moment, the inclusion of trade as an issue, trade-related indicators, is fairly weak in the ongoing negotiations and the current text. So if we want to have trade heavily embedded in the post-2020 biodiversity agreement, there does need to be more work to make sure it is featured in there. And I was very encouraged by UNCTAD and what they said, but that's a general truth, that it's a bit weak at the moment in the post-2020 agreement. But there are parallel initiatives also going on with companies, for example, science-based targets networks, to try and get companies rallying around how to make the sort of biodiversity outcomes of their work better. So that's the first point to make. Second point, second slide, please. These are just graphics taken from very recent work. I mean, this is actually culled from the WWF Living Planet report, but the data comes from other places. It's also exactly the same graphic, more or less, as in the Global Biodiversity Outlook of the CBD that came out last week, and probably is what's going to be reported at the UN sort of UNGAR meeting tomorrow in New York. Biodiversity is going down, whatever metric you use, it is in decline. And trade-related issues are one of the drivers that is causing general biodiversity decline. So that's the second point I wanted to make. Next slide, please. But there is increasingly large amounts of sort of economic work that shows that, you know, that doesn't have to be like that. The economic system doesn't always have to lead to inevitable loss and decline of biodiversity. So there is quite a lot of good work in the scientific literature around, how nature prevents economic losses. So here's just some example numbers. And there was a landmark, I think, report from WWF and other modelers this year around what the GDP economic consequences of a business as usual or a more green future might be. And they argued quite strongly that we could actually have a better economically positive future by changing certain parts of the way the world works, including trade policy, trade rules, trade arrangements were one of the things that were tweaked in these models to get these more positive GDP outcomes. So I think that's a key point, that it doesn't always have to lead to biodiversity decline if we have trading going on. Next slide, please. And again, last week, and in multiple parts of the CBD negotiations and in multiple parts of the announcements from different countries over the last couple of days, saying, we can bend the curve of biodiversity loss. Business as usual on this graphic to 2050. This is carefully modeled out by all kinds of modelers around the world. Will just continue to go down if we do nothing. But there are things that we can do to change that trajectory, and we can make nature go more positive, and we can also do that in ways that don't destroy the current economic system of the planet, and we can also feed the world at the same time. So there is very good modeling going on to show that these things are not an impossible dream. This is a work that's ongoing with colleagues in Austria, WWF, and a whole bunch of other partners. So that's another point to be made. Next slide, please. The Trade Hub project that we've been told about, yes, it's a £20 million UK government-funded research project. It's looking at the direct impacts of trade on wildlife. So it's looking at wildlife trade on land and wild meat trade on land. It's not looking at fish in the sea, but it's looking at wild species and trading systems and how they impact wild species on land. And it's looking at the indirect impacts on nature of agricultural commodity trades, mostly oil palm, soy, cocoa, coffee, rubber, various of the major commodities. But it's mostly trying to learn broad lessons that can be applied in different kinds of policies, CITES, CBD, UNFCCC, WTO, other kinds of areas of policy. Next slide, please. Agricultural commodity trades mostly. And it's also true that there are already ways to measure the impact of trade on biodiversity. So inside trade deals, inside agricultural commodity specific trades, inside the work of individual companies, inside various kind of aspects of the trading system, we can already kind of like show how much biodiversity is embedded within a trade deal, or the work of a particular company, or the work of on one particular supply chain. That's becoming increasingly possible, and I think over the next few years will be rolled out within trade deals, I hope, within the work of different companies and other regulatory mechanisms, certification schemes and whatever. So here's just some pretty diagrams showing that we can actually measure the impact on biodiversity of trade from somewhere to different countries. And this is really the final slide. This is back to the bending the curve work that came out a week or so ago, saying that these are the kinds of things that we can do if we want to, change these trajectories. So on the supply chain side, we can sustainably increase crop yields by doing better agriculture. So it's not about stopping agriculture, it's about doing agriculture better. You can reduce waste in the system. On the demand side, changing the kind of like diets that people are eating, changing the way food is consumed and reducing waste again. So there's all kinds of ways there that, we can get a better, more positive outcome. And there are the kind of like more proactive conservation measures, increasing area of protection. So many people are now going for 30% protected area or protected and conserved areas, and restoring areas areas to benefit nature, people, and the economy. So there are ways to change things that are nature positive and not trade negative. And just the final slide, please. So within the trade project, we're now going to try and take all these types of models and put in what happens if you change trade rules in the following ways. So can we tweak WTO types of rules, put them in these different kind of models and look at the different outcomes for nature, for people, for the economy? Can we do that across the board globally? Can we do it in different regions? So we're going to be busy doing that, and also linking it to GDP types of outcomes as well in the coming years. And we hope that that will be useful for all of these types of endeavors that you're all part of. And I think with that, I will say thank you very much. For people, for the economy. Can we do that across the board globally? Can we do it in different regions?
Well, thank you so much, Neil, for that excellent overview, and particularly for sharing that recent study, Bending the Curve study. So the points I took away were that you can be nature positive without being trade negative, but we need to have a very concerted effort. But I think this key point is that we can reduce the curve of biodiversity loss without reducing the ability to advance progress on other SDGs. And the trade policy will need to be part of that picture if we want to improve production, reduce waste, and so on in this sector. So very, very useful, and we look forward to learning more about your research as it advances, and it promises to provide some really excellent tools to guide stakeholders and policymakers in this area. So with that, I'm now going to turn to Angela Francis. She is the Chief Economist at WWF UK, where she leads on economics and economic development, as well as on trade and industrial policy for a green transition. As Neil alluded to, WWF has obviously been a key player in pushing for a new Green Deal for nature and in raising public awareness about the impacts on natural resources, of trade in natural resources, commodities, and agricultural products on biodiversity. So I'll turn the floor now to Angela.
Thank you, Caroline. Really glad to be part of the panel today. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you to all the panelists, and so many references already to the great work of WWF, who've been involved in trade for a long time, but now we think we're probably getting involved in a more activist way around not just supply chains, but also trade policy and the trade system. So to start with, I want to say I'm an optimist in terms of the role of trade in encouraging innovation and investment in the right type of systems, but absolutely acknowledge that there's a lot of work to do to make the system work for biodiversity. And I would say that's even more work than we've got to do on climate. And Neil alluded to some of the issues and challenges we face. So what I want to talk about today is the UK as a case study for food and farming and the issues around biodiversity and trade. And when I was thinking about the presentation this morning, I was thinking I almost had a Superman quote. If any of you know Superman, I want to talk about truth and justice, but not the American way. So it could be truth and justice in the American way. And if I was talking about fisheries management, America have done some fantastic work on the Marine and Mammal Protection Act, which is informing their trade policy. So I could have been using my Superman quote, but unfortunately the US is not such a good model of food and farming, which is where I want to focus. So my 3 points are going to be around truth, justice, and value. And that's how do we value nature and trade. So starting with truth, as we've heard, food and farming are responsible for 29% of global emissions, but they're also importantly the biggest driver of biodiversity loss. So that's 70% of terrestrial biodiversity loss and 50% of freshwater species loss. And that's not just from converting habitat, although that is important, it's also from how we farm and the pollution effects, nitrate effects of the farming system. So what I think we want to talk about in the trade world are the transition from and a battle, I would almost describe it as, between agroecological farming and conventional farming, which has been commercially optimized into what we could call an industrial farming system. So we've got these two systems, and how is trade encouraging one over the other? So if we describe agroecological farming as something that works with and enhances the natural systems, and industrial farming as being something that's very input dependent, it's a production of a narrow set of commodities that damages nature and it damages the climate. I think we can sort of see those two systems as one we want to move away from and one we want to move towards. And it's importantly, in terms of agroecological farming, not just about carbon efficiency, which can send us in lots of perverse directions, particularly if you compare per unit of meat. You end up with some strange logics, and economists really need to look at efficiency and inefficiency in a much broader sense, particularly in trade, looking at the inefficiency of using lots and lots of land for livestock feed that gives actually in the end relatively small amounts of nutritious food to people, and rather how the whole system changes. So I'm contrasting agroecological farming and industrial farming and thinking of them as renewables and fossil fuels equivalents of food production, the things we want to move towards and away from. And it's even more challenging because food is something that moves across borders. So all our domestic policy has to tie up with trade policy. So in terms of truth, we need data and transparency on the impact of those systems, and we need to design our trade policy so they differentiate between one or the other. And standards, I think, are very much more important than they have been to this point, and we need to be much more sophisticated in how our standards are used to discourage bad systems that we don't like, but also encourage good systems, and standards can actually make space and access for agroecological farming we'd like to encourage. So the UK is a really interesting case study here, because the UK has gone the furthest of all countries in reforming its agricultural subsidies towards what we talked about at the start, which is public money for public goods. So we're rewarding, the UK policy will reward land managers for carbon sinks, for habitat, for clean water and clean air. The UK is also taking forward a due diligence obligation in respect of removing deforestation from its supply chain. And this is something that WWF has been working on for years and is now coming to fruition. Two excellent areas of policy that the UK is impacting on food and supply chains. We also are a country that is developing new trade deals and potentially entering new regional plurilateral arrangements and taking a seat at WTO for the first time in 50 years. So we're a really interesting case study about how we link those bits of policy together. And in our conversations, what we're saying to government is, you can't ask producers to invest and innovate in the best environmental standards whilst you reward producers of the worst by giving them access to your markets. You can't design policy to encourage green food production at home, but then ignore the impact of your wider footprint and send signals into the market that you're very happy to take foods from other systems. So the UK so far has actually got, I think, potential to have a really leading framework on trade and biodiversity. So far, we are not displaying all of that in our trade policy, and WWF is pushing very strongly that we start to do that. There's an enormous opportunity because we have such a great domestic policy framework. So that's the truth point. Justice point. Most of the time we think about justice in terms of justice for the producer farmers, so for UK farmers, and it's a kind of compensatory justice concept for policy that impacts on them directly. But I think even more important for trade policy is thinking about international justice. So the transition to sustainable food production should not disadvantage developing countries. And so there's some great work that's been done by the FAO and BioVision, which was a report on agroecology that looks at how important agroecology is to build resilient livelihoods and farm systems. And that case study, those case studies and that meta-analysis showed that adopting agroecology has adaptation benefits, mitigation benefits, and it's also got biodiversity benefits in terms of overall diversity and healthy soils. And so we should be supporting those types of systems with aid and supporting people to meet standards to access European and UK markets. But we also need to tackle the unfair competition those producers would face from the industrial system. So we also need to ensure that we're measuring not just conservation, which is most relevant to developing countries, but also restoration. The UK National Food Strategy had some interesting proposals here around what they called core standards, where foods that met certain standards would have zero tariffs and zero quotas, and you could reserve those kinds of initiatives for places that have the best practice in positive farming for nature and positive farming in terms of carbon. And this is my last point. I know I'm slightly over time. My last point is around value. So how do we value the nature coming out of the agroecological farming system? It's very easy to talk about how we set aside land and use that for wetlands or conservation. That is not an issue usually for trade because it's not a production issue. It's not an agricultural subsidy problem, so that's fine. What's much more complicated and where we think we need a lot more effort is where we have multifunctional land, which is also what we want. So models are very often stuck in the trade system on compensating producers when they are taking things that limit their production, paying people in terms of costs incurred and income forgone. But that means that the best solutions, the type of solutions that give us positive nature and positive production outputs, which are possible, they have no incentive because you don't have a way of valuing them. So I'm really interested in two things: how governments and private investors can be buying ecosystem services and valuing them at more than a negative cost on production, valuing about what they're actually worth, and then exploring those transition repayments where things that are potentially really commercially valuable and good for the farmers and producers, but are not mainstream practice yet because we are moving from an industrial to an agroecological system, how those can be supported in a transition so that we move from one to the other. And that was my final point. So yes, truth, justice and value are the points I'd like to leave you with. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela, for that presentation. It's really great to hear and see WWF back in the international trade policy space. As an organization, they have so much experience and expertise on these issues, and it would be great to have the trade policy discussion informed by that going forward. Key points, thank you for emphasizing the issue of sustainable agriculture and food production as key to biodiversity conservation. And of course, we all know that agricultural trade is one of the big issues on the global trade agenda. So the integration of a stronger sustainability element into that is clearly important. I really appreciated the focus on doing so in a way that doesn't disadvantage developing countries, and we find ways to work for them and support, so that we actually support sustainable production and land management on the ground around the world, not just in the UK. So really useful presentation. Thank you so much. So I'm going to turn now to our second last speaker, who is Maria Julia Oliva. She is the Deputy Director of the Union for Ethical Biotrade, which our keynote speaker referenced earlier in her opening remarks. Julia is a lawyer. She's an expert on access and benefit sharing of genetic resources, and is going to talk us a little bit about the work of the Union for Ethical Biotrade to support biodiversity by working with partners in global supply chains, and to link this a little to the wider policy debate about biodiversity and trade. So Maria Julia, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you, Carolyn. It's a pleasure to join this panel. I was counting, I haven't lived in Geneva now for over 8 years, nor been directly involved in trade policy, so I was a little intimidated by joining this panel, but I'm glad that a lot of points that we are working with at the supply chain level and at the company level are coming up, so hopefully there are some useful notions there. As you mentioned, I work for the Union for Ethical Biotrade. It's an international nonprofit association based in Amsterdam. And it is, as Isabel mentioned earlier, a spin-off of the Biotrade initiative, which was set up by UNCTAD in 1996. And the Biotrade initiative really sought to promote the use of trade as a tool for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. And the Biotrade initiative is still carrying on vital work around policies that support biodiversity-friendly practices. At UEBT, what we do is support companies that use natural ingredients from biodiversity in food, cosmetics, natural pharmaceuticals, and that are seeking to transform their operations and their supply chains by addressing issues around, it was mentioned, restoration of biodiversity, sustainable use, all of the social and equity issues linked to biodiversity and supply chains, and are seeking to also communicate, distinguish themselves in the market based on this. And I wanted to show you just a couple of things. Oh, I have a blurred background. background, so maybe you can't see it. This is a lovely product by Veleda that has a UEBT logo in it. So that's a skin product, and then I also have some lovely chamomile that has an UTS logo, and that is a collaboration that UEBT and UTS have together around herbs and spices. So why are companies like Veleda and Albert Heijn that sells this tea, why are they engaging on biodiversity issues? Well, one reason is consumer expectations. UEBT has been conducting an international survey for the past 10 years that show increasing consumer awareness and demands from brands around biodiversity. So it's really addressing the expectations of their consumers. Biodiversity is also a key part of sustainability commitments. I think Neil mentioned the biodiversity year, which I've taken to calling the biodiversity moment whenever these meetings actually take place. But what is very clear to see in the private sector is that biodiversity as a notion is really gaining very strong roots and becoming a big part of the agenda. And you see it through different initiatives and tools that help companies to set targets. Neil mentioned the Science-Based Target Network. We also have a bunch of other initiatives helping companies measure their impact and also improving practices. And here's where the role of UBT as a standard system and other standards dealing with biodiversity are key. And of course, when you talk about voluntary standards, they are very important in setting good practices, but also create some tensions when it comes to trade. Another key point that is taking companies, that is piquing their interest on biodiversity are legal developments. Carolyn mentioned access and benefit sharing. This is the set of rules that derives from the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol, and that regulate the use of biodiversity for R&D. We have now over 125 countries that are party to the Nagoya Protocol, over 80 countries that have measures in place. And of course, for all the companies that use biodiversity in their innovation, in their R&D, this is also something that they really now need to look at. And at a policy level, this also still creates some questions around the link with trade and particularly intellectual property rules at the international and national level. Another important legal development for companies around the biodiversity space was mentioned by Angela, due diligence. There are increasing laws on due diligence around the notion of human rights, but also environment, deforestation, but also broader environmental issues. There is now an EU initiative looking at this issue. So clearly this means that companies are having to explore transparency, traceability along their supply chains, and also different ways of engaging with supplier. We hope that these types of developments don't lead companies to exclude some suppliers, particularly in developing countries, but actually to build partnerships with them that really lead to positive impact in their operations, in their products, and along their supply chains. So I guess I would finish with that. I remember being in Geneva, and a lot of the discussion around trade and environment was around tension. But, as I said, I've been gone for a few years, and I'm glad to see that we are moving also to look at opportunities. And I think that there are a number of, and these were also mentioned by our colleague from the French delegation, there's a lot of spaces to work towards win-win solutions. So I thank you for the opportunity to take part in this discussion and look forward to it continuing. Thanks, Carolyn.
Great. Thank you so much, Julia. Really appreciated the examples, the concrete examples from actually working with companies to see what are the challenges that they face in terms of ensuring that the products they produce comply with sustainability standards, and particularly around biodiversity. And I thought the great point you ended is, but that the approach looking forward should be one that is not about excluding suppliers as the end goal, but as a way of building partnerships with suppliers and producers in countries to produce more sustainably, and so that makes supply chains more sustainable. So I think there's many points that have come up for discussion, but I will turn now to Marianne Julie has already given us a few hints around some of the trade policy issues, but we'll turn to you to give us an overview of how we could better design and implement trade policy to support biodiversity conservation, sustainable use and restoration. You have the floor.
Great. Carolyn, can you just nod if you can hear me okay? Super. That's always good when you start. So my name is Marianne Kettunen, and I'm from the Institute for European Environmental Policy, IEEP. That is an independent, not-for-profit think tank based in Brussels and in the UK. And first of all, I want to say thank you for the organizers for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here to talk about biodiversity and trade today with you. I'm a policy analyst, so I'm going to pick up from where these previous speakers have left us, and I'm going to take a deep dive into the trade policy. People have before me have basically highlighted the role that trade policy can do for biodiversity. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go systematically through what trade policy is, where biodiversity in trade policy is at the moment, and what we can do better in the context of trade policy for biodiversity. So trying to make things even more concrete in terms of, how can we change trade policy in the future better for biodiversity. Could I get the next slide, please? So basically, the cornerstone for trade policy obviously are trade agreements. That's what we all know. And where biodiversity is in trade agreements is in a few different places. Obviously, trade is part of the biodiversity is part of the sustainability safeguards in trade agreements. So in the context of the European Union and European Union trade agreements, we have the so-called trade and sustainability development chapters, which encompass all the safeguards for environment and sustainability vis-a-vis trade that has been foreseen to take place in a trade context with a partner country. Sometimes these sustainability safeguards, they also provide explicit type of trade that is encouraged to be facilitated and can also be biodiversity friendly products. This brings us to this space of opportunities that has been mentioned, for example, by Angela and also I think by Jean-Marie earlier. So this is the space of opportunities that can be facilitated through trade agreements. But mostly where biodiversity is in the trade agreements is it's hidden, it's part of those impacts across the different trade sectors, agriculture, fisheries, forestry and mining, and the provisions that are put in place to create free trade or facilitate trade in a certain sector that then creates impacts for biodiversity. So that's basically where the face of biodiversity is being determined. And the dynamics between these different elements of a trade agreement is as follows. So the sustainability safeguards are there to try to, as they say, provide safeguards to protect biodiversity, safeguard biodiversity while trade is being liberated through these different sectoral agreements and sectoral provisions in the trade. Problem here is that this dynamic doesn't quite work. So in a way, the hidden impacts across different trade sectors, they're stronger than the safeguards at the moment can be counterbalancing. The safeguards are often based on the language of encouragement, language of promotion and recognition of biodiversity benefits, or recognition and promotion of biodiversity standards and international agreements. But they aren't very stringent in terms of actually taking action and being able to prevent the impacts on biodiversity. That's the general problem here. As a one example, when it comes to EU trade agreements, is that there is not a very stringent mechanism to enforce these sustainability safeguards at the moment. So basically, in general, the trade disputes in trade context in the EU or between EU and partner countries, there is a dispute settlement mechanism, part of the trade agreements, which includes a binding decision by an arbitration panel. But the trade and sustainable development chapters and these provisions, including biodiversity provisions, aren't part of this mechanism. So if there's a dispute around biodiversity impacts of trade in the context of EU trade agreement, that will be subject to consultation between trade partner countries, and if needed, there might be an establishment of panel of experts. But it doesn't really lead to any sort of financial compensation or blocking of trade as such. So the mechanism isn't really stringent enough to make these safeguards work. So that's kind of where we are within that key policy instrument that governs trade at the moment. That is, my experiences come from the EU level, but the same implies also more globally as well. So that brings us to the importance of trade impact assessments, to be able to understand how these hidden impacts across trade sectors actually take place and what's the extent of them. And I was absolutely delighted to hear Jean-Marie talking about the importance of trade impact assessments for France, because that, I think, where part of the gist is to make trade work for better for biodiversity in the future. Can I get the next slide, please? So we at IEP, together with partners, we specifically at the moment work in a space of EU sustainability impact assessments as an example here. What we've discovered and what the EU has in place is a guidance to carry out sustainability impact assessments for trade agreements. And biodiversity is one of the key aspects to be looked at in this context. So that is great. Biodiversity is a systematically element to be looked at in impact assessments when it comes to EU. But the problem is that when you look at the existing practice of how these sustainability impact assessments for trade have been carried out, there are several shortcomings in how biodiversity has been treated. So biodiversity isn't systematically looked at across all the sectors. It hasn't systematically looked at within sectors. It often relies on proxy indicators, and often there is no quantified information there. That is what Neil was saying, that he's saying earlier that we are getting better in terms of tools available here, but they haven't been yet brought into the impact assessment space for trade. Can I get the next slide, please? So that brings me to the question as to what can trade policy do for biodiversity and address biodiversity crisis better. And I've highlighted 3 elements here that I think would be worth taking forward in the future. So firstly, take these trade sustainability assessments and make them more comprehensive, systematic, and quantitative for biodiversity to look at the impacts, so that we know the truth. As Angela was referring to the truth, we need to have these working better to know the truth, to be able to make trade better for biodiversity. We should also look at that relationship between where biodiversity is at the moment in trade agreements and where biodiversity impacts happen in trade agreements. So what I call this is trying to unbox the biodiversity provisions from the sustainability box that they are currently in trade agreements and integrate them better in those sector relevant provisions in trade agreements. So when we, for example, talk about agriculture and have a chapter for agriculture in trade agreements, we would already there have safeguards and issues linking to biodiversity, not only in a specific safeguard section. I think that would make a difference. And the third element here is the stakeholder engagement. So stakeholder engagement is part of all trade agreements, whether it's EU or between any other countries in the world. If we would make sure that the engagement of stakeholders is timely and more proactive, and specifically ensures that biodiversity experts are involved, this would support the implementation of trade agreements in the future, make them also more transparent, and have this as a civil society to be part of the trade agreement implementation in a much more supportive way to help the better developments in the future. Can I get the next slide, please? Then what I like to always highlight in this context of trade policy and trade policy tools is that you have the trade agreements and impact assessments that support them. But then outside that, we have what I call the trade flanking policy that is really important to address the biodiversity crisis in context of trade. And what we talk about here, we talk about the improving of domestic standards, already mentioned by people earlier. So basically making sure that your domestic standards only allow import of products that meet certain baseline standards for biodiversity. In the context of EU, we have these in place for non-illegally logged timber, for example, and we're moving on to looking at how can we ensure there's no deforestation through our imports. We need to reform the national subsidies because obviously these distort the trade and they often have negative impacts on biodiversity and environment at the moment. And the reason why trade policy is important here is because the distortion impact, and therefore that brings trade policy an opportunity to also address the subsidy issues at a national level. And then there's the possibility to use development cooperation and aid for trade policies that can target infrastructure, processes and capacity building in a trade partner country. So for example, EU putting standards in place and then using its development cooperation to support the third country or the partner country to actually meet these standards. So the trade becomes more sustainable and also provides opportunities sustainably for both parties as well in this context. So just to say, we basically have the trade policy, we should look at definitely that, trade policy in terms of trade agreements, but also look at outside the trade agreements where certain things are being negotiated and discussed, which then impact the trade policy and trade agreements. So both spaces in a policy context are important when we move into the future. And the standards are often in this blanking policy context. So these are negotiated in the EU or domestic level, and then they kind of impact the trade as we know it. Final slide, please. So as a final slide, I have provided you my personal top 3 leverage points, action points for future. So not surprisingly, first point is about sustainability impact assessments. So making those work for biodiversity, as I said earlier. The second one is about standards. I do think that creating sustainability standards to support sustainable value chains that don't harm ecosystem biodiversity is going to be key in the future. And as I said, this will happen a lot also at the national level in the EU context. So we should basically look at that space as well, in addition to actual trade negotiation space. And my final point is to support circular economy through trade, because that will help to diminish pressures on ecosystems and biodiversity. The reason why I'm highlighting this is that biodiversity isn't yet as much on the agenda of trade partner countries as I would hope it to be. I hope it's getting there. I think we all hope and think it's getting there. But circular economy certainly is there on the agenda already. And circular economy is a key way, as I say, to diminish pressures. So there are some win-win opportunities here to also keep an eye on a different agenda than simply biodiversity, to create win-wins for biodiversity and support more sustainable trade for biodiversity in the future. So those are my few points, food for thought. Thank you for that, and looking forward to discussion.
Great. Thank you very much, Marianne. I'd like to quickly move to the discussion. We have just over 20 minutes left for that. So I've just gathered some of the questions that we have from the floor, and I just posed them to all of the speakers, and you could dive in on the ones that appeal to you most. So my key reflection from what we're hearing is that, and starting from Stephen's opening remarks, is that we need an approach to biodiversity and trade that works for economies and societies everywhere in order for it to be sustainable politically and to really be consistent with the SDGs. So here, one question I have is, how could we upgrade or expand Biotrade so that we don't look at sort of green exports as being a niche market, but more sort of the mainstream of agricultural production and trade, or commodities trade. The second issue relates to standards, because several people have spoken about those, and clearly standards are the way that many governments are looking at to both protect their environmental efforts at home and also as a way to reduce their carbon footprint of their environmental footprint abroad. But there are also a lot of questions about how to do so in ways that are inclusive and fair, and specifically for poorer farmers, for instance, in developing countries. So we need to think about how we can design standards in a fair and more transparent way. There was a specific question here for Jean-Marie around, as a result of the EU position on Mercosur and deforestation, are you seeing the Mercosur countries engage more proactively or supportively on biodiversity issues? So has there been any movement on their side? And then a final issue really is to link back to what could be done nationally and multilaterally to bridge the biodiversity and trade stakeholders and policy making on these issues. We've seen today that there is actually really a wealth of knowledge out there. There's an array of initiatives, there's excellent policy proposals on the table, but it's not really a mainstream environment and trade issue yet. So what could we do both at the WTO and nationally to try and move that agenda forward? So I open the floor. I might just take us in turn. I might go firstly to Steve. Put you on the spot. Sorry, Steve. Yep, I can't see him. Okay. Is Isabel still there? No. Jean-Marie, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Carolina. I'll be on the question of Mercosur. I prefer not to answer very clearly because, quite frankly, the information is more in Brussels than in Geneva. And as you know, the Commission is leading us in Europe and into the negotiation. So political signals that I've been reading from from Geneva will probably not give you the full picture. But I'll try to work on the question and see with my people if we have something stronger to answer. On the more general issue of how can trade tools contribute efficiently. First, I'd like to remind that before all, it is a matter of cooperation and dialogue, not a confrontational approach. And even since the beginning, when the NAFTA, I think the NAFTA was the first big agreement with an environment chapter, and this was about creating some avenues for dialogue between the members of the NAFTA. So we are still in that, and we still think it is the more efficient. And the WTO can contribute. For instance, if you take a very sensitive issue like palm oil sustainability, the CTE, the Committee on Trade and Environment, has been a place where sustainable practices of palm oil production have been expressed and can help overcome the oppositions. Now, behind that, of course, there still need to be some teeth, trade teeth to leverage environment. And here there are several principles. First, you can use unilateral preferences, and some level of conditionality on environment can be leveraging environment, of course, proportionate to the capacities of countries and their commitment for environment. Second, coherence between your internal policies and your external policy. What would you export? What you ban on your domestic market? So that's just a very simple principle. You don't export the waste that you don't want for yourself. And third, there is at one point the need to be able to say, no, we will ban imports which are contributing to, for instance, deforestation or other biodiversity causes for destruction. So this would be very quickly my answer.
Great, thank you very much, Jean-Marie. I like the. I think the key point you made there is that we sort of need a nuanced approach that has both a cooperation dimension, but there also needs to be the scope to be clear in terms of conditionality or enforcement on key issues. So, should I turn now to Angela, please?
Thank you. Yes, so if I take the first two questions, which I think kind of are connected around how you encourage biotrade and what we can do around standards that are inclusive and fair, I think it's really important that as we look at developing metrics, we are both encouraging conservation, which is vital if we are not to bend the curve, which is critical for our environmental targets, but we encourage conservation and restoration. And the requirement to conserve falls mostly on developing countries which are developing their agricultural systems, but the restoration target falls much more on advanced economies that have very big, powerful agricultural economies that are in many ways setting the rules. So there needs to be a strong element of our measures which act on them at the same time as we're trying to conserve, because I think one of the issues around being inclusive and fair is that as we increase these environmental requirements in our standards, we're acting evenly on developing and developed countries. So one of the things I think will be interesting, an interesting area to start to explore, and it will be based on some of the data and analysis that's coming out of Trade Hub, which is WWF is part of, is starting to explore the landscape, the natural biodiversity outcomes from the landscape that food is coming from, and what is the direction of travel in that landscape. So if you have a place that is able to preserve its biodiversity whilst farming, that should be very highly rewarded in the farming system. And if you have a place that, if I can call it this, is a dead zone, essentially for nature, somewhere where because of the farming system you have, it's not diverse, you have extensive monocrops, you are relying on herbicides and pesticides because you don't have any of the natural ecosystems to keep those pests and weeds under control. you don't have a mixed system, so you're very heavily requiring inputs, and you are producing lots of outputs, if we like it, if we can call it that, which are the pollution, the water consequences around nitrates. Those dead zones should be very heavily penalised in the system, and you can only do that when you, as a country, I think, as Marianne says, have got your house in order. You have to have strong domestic policy to say, we have a system where we are we're looking at the farm landscape, and we will penalise places that are not contributing to the ecosystem restoration, and we will encourage those places that are. And I think that's a way you can give developing countries a very strong incentive for them to start farming in ways that maintain the biodiversity and the richness they have, which ultimately will, I think, secure long-term agricultural productivity, long-term sustainability of those industries. So yes, I think it's for me it's how we look at this is I know this is very, very complicated. This isn't just looking at the activity, this is looking at the outcome for the environment in the place the food is coming from. And I think getting to certification for farming areas is a very important area for us to start developing our metrics.
Great. Thank you very much, Angela. I'll now turn the floor. I think, is Jean-Marie still with us? He has gone. I think he's gone. Okay, so I will turn the floor now to Neil, please. You need to unmute. Yeah.
So I'm going to answer a bit differently. So in terms of trade in wildlife, I mean, so as one part of the trade, I think it's pretty clear that all kinds of illegal trade in wildlife are bad. So, the illegal trade that goes on in wildlife around the planet, it should be, vigorously curtailed. I mean, there's lots of work trying to do that, but I think that's one lesson. In terms of legal trade in wildlife that's used for fashion items or for clothing, there are both examples of legal trade driving wildlife declines, and there are examples of legal trade driving wildlife increases. So there are examples where you can have trading systems that enhance the population of wild species that are in the traded system. So vicuna and alpaca and various kind of like high value wool animals in South America. Populations have gone up because of the trading system. Crocodiles have gone up because of trading systems, and there are even people in South Africa who argue that the population of white rhinos have gone up because of the possibility of trading them, even though trading is difficult at the moment or impossible. So, there's the wild animal side of how to make things better. In the agricultural commodities side of trade, it's much harder. Well, if your agricultural commodities are coming from Western Europe or places where the landscape is fairly heavily degraded, there are multiple ways that you can make the biodiversity aspects of your agricultural production better. So the monoculture thing that Angela just talked about, but just in general, the UK uplands, the UK lowlands, most of Europe could have more biodiversity positive agricultural trades. I mean, the way to do that is pretty well known. So I think that's not a huge hardship to actually make that happen. When Europe is trading with Brazil or Indonesia and sourcing products that are being produced from high biodiversity forest habitats that are being cut down and converted to monoculture plantations, then that's where there's really big biodiversity loss. And so anything in those kind of agreements or those kind of farming systems that can use land more efficiently, reduce waste, use degraded land, not just convert high biodiversity natural habitat, is going to be biodiversity positive, or at least reduce loss. So there is, again, lots of roles and importance in the UK and the EU and other nations that are trading with developing countries. But again, those systems have to be set up in a way that's obviously fair and equitable, but not massively biodiversity damaging. And I think that's where I think there's a huge challenge in how do you make that happen. Anyway, there's a few reflections.
Great. Great. Thank you very much, Neil. Thank you. And I'll just turn, I think we have Maria Julia and then Marianne.
Great, thanks. Yeah, also excellent points already made by the panelists. I think the point Neil was making about finding biodiversity in what may seem unlikely places, but in fact, biodiversity is not niche. We don't have to look at the Amazon to find biodiversity. So biodiversity-friendly practices, we found as UEBT, you can have actually a huge positive impact in places growing onion in Germany, or in bergamot in southern Italy. So mainstreaming the concept is part of making it not a niche concept, but really part of all of agriculture and wild collection activities. I also think that biodiversity-friendly practices need to take a stepwise approach. So not everybody will be fully green, and not everybody should claim to be fully green, but we should understand that there's a stepwise process and that everybody should get on the ladder, basically, I think is important. I think in terms of standards, as Angela mentioned, the fact that, standards and improved practices are hugely in the benefit of people in developing countries where there's a lot of challenges, social, environmental. The challenge is not whether you have standards or not, but what kinds of tools, how are these standards developed so that they include and they empower local suppliers rather than create an obstacle. And this has to do with approaches that are geared towards small producers, SMEs, but also being innovative, so moving beyond certification to different types of ways of engaging and assuring good practices, and also the use of technology. I just think it's amazing what we see is out there in terms of very simple technologies that can empower suppliers at the local level to be able to monitor and improve practices. And then just to say, I really liked in terms of trade policies, I really liked Marianne's point about unboxing the issue of biodiversity, and this just needs to be something that comes up in all discussions rather than as a separate discussion on the interface. So I'm all for that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very, very much, Maria Julia. We go now to Marianne.
Great. I'm going to pick up a question from the chat box that was directed to me, if that's okay. So I was asked, what are the main challenges to make the Trade and Sustainable Development chapters legally binding, and how should breaches be sanctioned? So on that very topic, starting from the second part of the question, how should breaches be sanctioned? I think they should be sanctioned in a similar way as any trade-related breach. Carolyn, sorry, can you hear me? Yes, super. Because I was looking at your face and thinking that am I not on speaking mode? But I am. Super. Thank you. So to say it again, I think breaches regarding biodiversity or any trade and sustainable development chapter space should be sanctioned in a similar way as any breach within the trade agreement. So basically, that means that we would be using a similar mechanism to address non-compliance for sustainable related issues than we would be on trade quotas or anything in the hardcore trade space. That would be my answer to it. What are the main challenges to make this happen? I think it's political will, fundamentally. So we would need to tackle the political will, and to tackle political will to do this brings us back to making biodiversity important. Making biodiversity important also outside the trade, making biodiversity important in a way that we understand how it underpins our socioeconomic wealth and well-being, and also our health. So in a way that kind of brings us even a step back from trade, making sure that the biodiversity community and also now the trade community keep on banging on that message that we really, biodiversity really is important, and therefore it also needs to be considered more prominently in the context of trade. And in a trade context, people have been mentioning the opportunity space. Absolutely. Opportunities is always much more nicer way to start a dialogue and get everybody on your side than, starting with on an offensive side. But I think, what we need to do in the future is have these opportunities and the dialogue on opportunities really backed up by a certain push that comes from the national side or EU side or negotiator side in terms of those standards. So kind of quickly starting to put those standards in place, but in dialogue with the trade partner countries that create cooperation, how to then use those standards for both benefits or mutual benefits. So I think, it's basically things we need to take forward in parallel track. And there is always a worry that, for example, the standard conversation takes flight and then becomes, instead of becoming a more cooperation space, it becomes more of an offensive space. Well, here are standards, you will have to apply with these. So try to avoid that development in the future. But those are my few pennies worth and a specific answer to the question that was asked from me as well. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you very, very much, Marianne. I think we should probably start to draw to a close. We have 5 minutes left. Did any of the speakers have an extra point they wish to make? No?
Can I strongly support Maria Julia's point around enabling and empowering with technology and data. I think one of the things that's going to be really interesting for the future of agroecology and agroecology and encouraging biotrade is how we turn what you might call the requirement to have data around biodiversity and species and kind of nature within a farm setting from a barrier to an asset that those farmers and land managers feel empowered and able to sell products from somewhere because they understand the value of the land they're managing, and making that a real positive for them, rather than, I think, how sometimes it might feel like a requirement to collect lots of data that somebody else cares about. I'm really interested in how those ecosystem services become not only important for the food sales, but become important as a market in of themselves, and having multifunctional land that can be providing habitat, carbon, water filtration, all of those things, I think, will become interesting markets. And actually having the data and knowledge should be something we're encouraging and enabling and empowering, particularly developing country small farmers to own and want to engage in, rather than it feel like a barrier.
Great. Thank you very much, Angela. I noticed that we have Jean-Marie back. So I just wanted to quickly turn to him before I close, which is, we've seen today there's sort of this tremendous community of experts and stakeholders interested in this issue of biodiversity and trade. And I just wanted to come back. You mentioned in your remarks at the beginning this initiative of a statement or a new initiative at the WTO on environmental sustainability and trade. And do you think that this is an issue that could be taken up in that context? And what do governments need to hear from environmental stakeholders to really drive that agenda forward?
Well, thank you, Caroline. Yes, there was actually in preparation for the last ministerial, which should have been held in Kazakhstan in June, there was this project of a plurilateral declaration from the Friends of Environment in WTO. This has been a little bit derailed by COVID, but now the work has been restarting, and the question is to try to push for an adoption as early as possible. So there is still a little debate on the date. A little bit of confusion has come out from a typo in a EU communication, but the typo has been corrected. So now the question is whether we could adopt this declaration at the next ministerial or before, at the first political occasion, or the fast declaration that I'm referring to. And of course, this would be a vehicle which could informally allow for discussing any issues, and biodiversity should be injected into that at a moment. From my national perspective, we would be, of course, very favorable to that. Now, it will be an EU decision to make what to put on the agenda. But yes, this has to happen, and happen quickly in our view.
Great. Thank you very much for clarifying that, Jean-Marie. So I have a minute left to close. I won't try to summarize such a rich discussion, but I do want to come back to Isabel's opening remarks, which was that trade can and should be part of any solution to biodiversity loss. And that in doing so, we need to look at it as an environmental issue, but it's also a social and economic one as well. I think a key theme here is we need to not see biodiversity as a niche issue, but if indeed a third of the world's GDP is linked to biodiversity, then it's sort of a mainstream concern that needs to go across how we think about the kinds of goods and products and services and technologies that we're trading internationally, to think about their implications for biodiversity, looking both for challenges and also opportunities. And as we're here in the Geneva Trade Week context, I think it's really important to end with this note about the importance of dialogue among stakeholders and among governments on issues of environment, trade, and trade in the context of the SDGs. And here, for those of you who are not aware of it, I encourage you to ask your governments how and whether they're going to support a statement on environmental sustainability and trade at the WTO as a way of reasserting the importance of this issue among members and looking for proactive ways forward through dialogue and action that countries can start to really work together and cooperate on some of these issues. Stephen at the beginning mentioned that there were dual public goods. One of them is nature and one of them is a multilateral trading system. So if we can help them to work together to both support nature and to support a trading system that is fair and rules-based, that would really be a good outcome for both. So I think I'm only left now to thank on behalf of Unep and UNCTAD all of our speakers for their participation, and for all of you who have stuck with us during the session today. It will be available online afterwards on the YouTube channel. And on behalf of the organizers of Geneva Trade Week, I'd also ask you to consider filling in the post-session survey, which should be available to you when you sign off from this session. And just to encourage all of you to stay engaged with UNEP and UNCTAD and the many organizations that were mentioned or participated in today's discussion, so that we can continue a hopefully cooperative dialogue on ways forward on biodiversity, conservation, sustainable use and restoration, and on trade. So thank you all so much for taking the time to join us, and we look forward to staying in touch in the future. Thank you.